Hello, bar crawlers. So I have a story for you. It is going to involve carnage. Let's have some carnage here. But it is a very important story. It's about a ship that, from World War II, that is one of the most famous ships, and the sinking of this ship is one of the most famous sinking of ships in wartime. And so it was pretty interesting. And today, May 27th, is the anniversary of the sinking of this ship. And that ship was the Bismarck. I have all of my notes here. So it's one of two ships that were built in the Bismarck class of ships. It was the Bismarck and the Tirpitz, and they were the largest ships ever built by Germany, and two of the largest ever built by European powers. Like, still, as of now, as of 2023, still two of the largest ships ever built in Europe, and the two largest ever built by Germany. And this one, it was named after the 19th century German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Of course, the Tirpitz was named after the World War I Admiral Tirpitz. But that was still being worked on. The Bismarck was finished first. It was launched on February 14th, 1939, and commissioned on August 24th, 1940. It was up in the North Sea area, and it went on several training missions in some of the protected waters that were controlled by the Germans up in that area. However, at 2 a.m. on May 19th, 1941, it left for its first run out into non-German waters. And it was joined by a heavy cruiser called the Prinz Eugen. Excuse me. The British knew that it was being built and that it was going out. And this being the biggest ship ever at that point in time, they wanted to stop it before it made it to the Atlantic. Out in the Atlantic, it would be in open water, which would be harder to find. And then also the rest of the German fleet was stationed on the Atlantic coast of France, and it could get support from other. They could go out in a convoy and do a lot of damage. However, the British weren't sure exactly how the ship was going to get from the North Sea to the Atlantic, whether it was going to go between Iceland and Ireland or Iceland and Greenland. So they sent a bunch of ships out to both to try to block it. And they decided to take the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen and go through what's known as the Straits of Denmark, which are between Iceland and Greenland. The main British ships that were there were the battlecruiser HMS Hood and the battleship, the HMS Prince of Wales. And the Prince of Wales was actually a relatively newly commissioned ship. It was new battleship, all that stuff. The HMS Hood actually was built during World War I. It was built, 20 years earlier, 20 plus years earlier by this point in time, almost 25 years earlier. And it was kind of the ship of the British Navy, that it was the darling. It was the one that would go to when they were doing different diplomatic stuff. They would send the Hood. When any of the royal family were going places, they would be escorted by the Hood. It was the ship. Everybody in Britain knew the Hood. And but unfortunately, because it had been built 25 years earlier and was kept busy doing all of these fancy little things, it hadn't really been updated. So, sorry, I've got my dogs here and they're trying to eat my food. Stop it. So the biggest issue, because it wasn't something that they really had to deal with in World War I, was shells that would drop onto the deck, that at the time of in World War I, it was still fire. You get close enough that you could fire straight across and you would hit the side of the ship. But by World War II, they were far enough apart where the shells would go up in a huge arc and come down and hit the deck of the ship. But the hood had not been updated to have more armor on the deck of the ship. And I wonder if that's going to play a part later. It totally does. So, on May 24th, at about 5:45 a.m., the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen come under fire, actually, because they had actually been given directions, don't start a battle. It's just the two of you guys. We need you to get to France. That was their goal, get to France. So they weren't going to start things. But the Hood and the Prince of Wales were trying to stop it from doing that. So they were going to start things. So the Hood and the Prince of Wales started firing on them. The Hood actually originally thought that the Prinz Eugen was the Bismarck and started firing on the Prinz Eugen. Realized, oh shit, I'm firing on the wrong ship, and had to adjust to fire on the Bismarck. Now again, because this ship was old, it was still needing to turn to fire a broadside, that the turrets wouldn't move the same to turn the guns to be able to fire from all angles. So the Hood had to actually turn to fire on the Bismarck. And at 6 a.m., 15 minutes into this battle, and 8 minutes after it started firing, the Hood was turning to get a better aim at Bismarck and was hit by one of those dropping shells that was from farther away, that it came up and came down. It actually went straight through the deck, tore into an ammunition magazine, and exploded. Out of 1,419 men who were on the Hood, 3 survived. That's it. Just 3. This was a big deal for multiple reasons for the British, beyond losing almost 1,500 men. It was the Hood, and it was, like I said, the darling of the British Navy at that point in time. So it was a huge, horrible blow to public morale in Britain at the time, to lose the Hood after 8 minutes of battle. 8 minutes, that's it. And it also showed how dangerous the Bismarck was. That, boom, got it right away. So the Hood was gone. The Prince of Wales was still going, and the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen fired on the Prince of Wales and did some bad damage, and the Prince of Wales retreated. So again, the Bismarck and the Prinz Eugen had been told just get to France. So they were like, okay, cool, they're retreating, we're out, we're going. And however, the Bismarck had actually been hit 3 times, and the worst one was near the front and had created a hole in the side on the front, and it had allowed water to flood in and contaminate some of the fuel oil. So that meant that they didn't have extra stores of fuel oil, because they couldn't use this. So they really had to get to port in France, because they were going to need to fix the hole and refuel. Also, they didn't stop at all to do any sort of just quick fixing. So as the Bismarck was going through the water, this hole in the front was widening, and more water was coming in, and this oil was leaking out. So flooding was getting worse, but there was now an oil slick. It was creating an oil slick, so that if like planes flying over could see the oil and basically follow the Bismarck. So they were kind of, worried about all of that. And since the Hood had been destroyed, basically the entire British Navy had been told, get this guy, get the Bismarck, destroy it, do whatever you have to do. So the whole, basically, like, obviously not the whole thing because they were all over the place. But, and this was in May of 1941. So they were kind of busy in the war right then. But every ship that could was headed towards the Atlantic and the area where they were able to guess where the Bismarck was. I mean, they were coming up from the Mediterranean. They were coming down from, they had ships coming in as quickly as they could out from Scapa Flow, although those were a little bit behind because that was on the other side of England. But all of the ships that had been waiting for the Bismarck in all the different places, they were all like aiming for this. Everybody was going for the Bismarck at this point in time. And the Bismarck was going as fast as it possibly could, which again was dangerous when there's a freaking hole in the side of the ship. And it was at times stripping the Prinz Eugen, which was not as fast as the Bismarck. And, but it was one of those things that both going through the North Sea and then in the Atlantic, the amount of luck that the Bismarck had in hiding from the British was insane. Like going through the North Sea, there kept being like random fogs, and so they couldn't track the ship as well and all this stuff. And then in the Atlantic, headed towards France, the British kept losing the Bismarck. And at one point, during one of the night times, and I can't remember, and I should have looked it up just now, the exact one, whether it was the night of the 24th or the night of the 25th, one of those nights, the Bismarck actually, so it was going down from the North Atlantic, trying to get to France, trying to get to port in France. And remember, it had been over by Greenland, and so it was going across, trying to get to France, and it was being followed by a ton of ships. And at one point, it actually broke off from the Prinz Eugen at night, went around, and actually came back behind the British ships that were chasing it. And actually probably would have gotten away with that. And because the British ships completely lost it. It was at night. They didn't see it happen. They had no clue. The next morning, the sun came up, and the Bismarck wasn't in front of them like it had been before. However, for some reason, the Bismarck decided to send a message to the Germans stationed in France to say, hey, this is what's going on. And they sent this really long friggin' message on the radio. And the British were able to use that to triangulate where the friggin' Bismarck was, and they found it again. But then they lost it again. Like, that was the thing, over and over. They would find it, and then they would lose it, and they would find it, and they would lose it. But they knew now about where it was, and so they sent some planes to try to find it. The planes did a bombing run with torpedoes, missed entirely. Then they went back, and they were going to do it again, but they had lost the ship, and then they found the ship again, and so finally a group of swordfish planes, which were biplanes, the type with the two things, biplanes, were the ones who found the Bismarck on May 26th. Do I have? It was in the evening. It was in the evening. I didn't write down the exact time. I failed. So they were coming back in for another torpedo run, and it just so happened that the Bismarck was in the middle of a turn. It was turning to the side, similar to what the Hood was doing when it got messed up. And during this turn, it was hit by two torpedoes, one which did almost no damage, but then the other one did a little bit of damage. So one of the things with the Bismarck was that it had great armor on the sides. So yeah, no damage. But the second torpedo hit near the port rudder shaft and damaged the assembly of the actual rudder, like the rudder chain, all of this stuff that controlled the rudder. And it caused the rudder to stick at a 12-degree angle, which meant that without being able to go down there and literally like stop the ship, they would need to be out of the water to fix this, because it's at the rudder, it's at the back, and it's like underwater. They were going in circles. That was it. They were stuck going in circles, and there was nothing they could do about it. Just before midnight, about 20 minutes before midnight, they sent a message to Germany that the ship was unmaneuverable and that they would fight to the last shell. And they basically did. They did as much as they could. So the next morning, so that night, because during the night, the Bismarck wasn't doing anything, was going in circles. So most of the British ships actually hung back. But the next morning they started firing on the Bismarck again. It was damaged. It was something where, this is where it's kind of the British being assholes. Like, they were getting their revenge for the Hood. So the next morning, 4 British ships fired over 2,800 shells at the Bismarck. They destroyed everything, like the forecast, everything that sticks up off of a battleship was basically gone. Hundreds of men killed, just gone. And by 9:30 on May 27th, the Bismarck had been hit so many times and so much that all 4 of the main turrets were too badly damaged to fire back. So it stopped firing. But that didn't stop it stopped firing. It didn't have guns available to fire, and still the British were firing on this ship. That's where it's like, dudes, call me tits. But the Germans decided that they would rather scuttle the ship rather than let it fall into British hands, rather than give the British this amazing ship that the ship part of it, the underwater part, was still in almost perfect condition, except for the rudder, and could have been towed back to a British port and fixed. And they were like, no, we can't do that. So they went ahead and they set charges, and the scuttling charges detonated at 10:20 a.m. It finally sank at about 10:40. By this time, there were only about 400 men still alive and in the water. 110 of them were rescued by 2 different British ships, before reports came in that there was a U-boat in the area. And the British ships were told to leave to protect themselves. So out of the 400 men, they only rescued 110 before they took off. And that evening, and then the next day, 5 more men were picked up. 5 more men were alive and picked up. One of them died shortly thereafter. So out of 2,200 men total, 114 survived the sinking of the Bismarck. The ship was basically lost underwater because it actually slid down a hill. It was a whole thing. So it wasn't in the exact place where it had been scuttled, because there was a shelf in the ocean floor, and it had slid down and off to the side. But on June 8th, 1989, it was found. The exact location was kept a secret because they didn't want it to be looted, because it was a war grave. But yeah, one of this one incident, the first time the Bismarck actually went out, 2 major ships, the ship of the British Navy and the ship of the German Navy, were both destroyed. The Tirpitz was still alive and well. However, the sinking of the Bismarck was so bad for the morale of Germany that they didn't want the Tirpitz to also go out and have the same thing happen and be destroyed a few days after it left port. So it was actually hidden in a Norwegian fjord for the rest of the war, and the Tirpitz never went out and never did what it was built for. It's sad because all of these people died and this war was incredibly stupid. And it doesn't seem like many of us have learned. There are neo-Nazis out there. There are people out there who think that nationalism is the way to go, who think that we should hurt people who are different than us. And we haven't learned. And it's sad that all of these men died and we are making the same mistakes again and again. And it's one of those where, I saw, there was like a little cartoon or something one time that, people who don't study history are doomed to repeat it, and people who study history are doomed to watch it happen again and again. And it is frustrating. And y'all know I'm more of a World War I girl, but for the things that I really like in World War II are always the Navy. Just because that's something that didn't really happen much in World War I. They only had the Battle of Jutland. But it is interesting to me to see how we're repeating ourselves from both of those wars and how we are not learning. And this is obviously a really long video. I'm so sorry. Usually I try to keep these just a few minutes long, and we are now over 20 minutes long. So I'm very sorry. But yep, today is the anniversary of the sinking of the Bismarck, and something that I think should be remembered for both the good and bad. It was so good that the Bismarck did not have a chance to make it out as, have a chance to truly fight. And because it destroyed the Hood in 8 minutes. And who knows what kind of damage it could have done. And that was without trying to fight. Like, it wasn't trying to fight at that point in time. It was trying to get somewhere. And so think about how much worse it could have been if it had been able to get into a convoy and go out along the Atlantic. It would have been crazy. So it's good that the Bismarck never got a chance to do that. And it's good that they were so scared of anything happening to the Tirpitz that they never used the Tirpitz. And it's interesting that those two names those two people had such an impact on things that led to World War I, which of course directly led to World War II. And so it's so fascinating to me. And Mo is right now whining at me because he wants some food. Oh, he honked. Sorry. Whenever he's angry, he honks. Sorry about that. But okay. So I gotta go before my dogs eat my food. Love you guys. Have fun. Bye. Mwah.